So for the second part of any discussion of nomenclature, there's one kind of, I guess, secondary group of compounds that you need to be familiar with. And those are your polyatomic ions. Kind of by definition, these are basically just multiple atoms that come together to form a molecule that has a charge. There was a handful that I asked y'all to be familiar with, and those are, just one second. Sulfate, phosphate, carbonate, acetate, cyanide, and ammonium. That was kind of your first group of polyatomic ions that I want you to be familiar with. The others were perchlorate, chlorate, chlorite, and hypochlorite. So perchlorate, well, actually, I'll start with sulfate. Sulfate is a compound that has a formula of SO4 2-. So what that means is it's one sulfur atom, 4 oxygen atoms, and those all combine to give a -2 charge. Phosphate is PO4 3-. Carbonate is CO3 2-, and acetate is C2H3O2 1-. All of these, sulfate, phosphate, carbonate, those all contain oxygen. Now, the numbers of oxygen vary a little bit, and the overall charges of those species vary a little bit, but that's what those individuals are called. Cyanide is Cn-. One thing that I want you to recognize about all 4 or all 5 of these is that these are all anions. So they have a negative charge. Ammonium is NH4 plus, therefore it is a cation. It is the only polyatomic cation that we need to be familiar with. Now, there's a little bit of a scheme and a little bit of a system when you look at the other 4 ions that I want you to be familiar with. Perchlorate, chlorate, chlorite, hypochlorite, ClO4-, ClO3-, ClO2-, and ClO-. So perchlorate, chlorate, chlorite, hypochlorite, those are all molecules that have a -1 charge. What vary between them is the number of oxygens that are present. Those all have a kind of a pattern. The way that I like to know those is I like to know perchlorate, then just think, okay, if I change that name and I drop the PER, now I'm talking about chlorate. Okay, I've now dropped 1 oxygen. Chlorite, my suffix is different, ITE. And rather than having 3 oxygens, I have 2 oxygens. And then last but not least, hypochlorite is ClO with a single oxygen and a -1 charge. So anytime that you encounter these polyatomic ions, well, it's going to influence, compounds that you work with. So if we were to have a compound that was ammonium as a cation paired up with something like sulfate, that compound's full name would be ammonium sulfate. You're going to have a compound that has no overall charge. And in order to do that, well, sulfate has a -2 charge. Ammonium has a +1 charge. So in order to get the ammoniums to basically cancel out the charge of sulfate, you've got to have 2 of them. So you'd write that NH4, and then you're going to put this in parentheses to indicate that there are 2 of them. Is there a problem that you have the first thing or the first species in parentheses? Not at all. NH4 parentheses 2 SO4, ammonium sulfate. That's our compound that we're talking about there. And that's the name of it. So we're not really doing anything to change our ion names or anything like that. It's just important whenever you're talking about polyatomic ions that you know the different ions that there are and their full names of those polyatomic ions. So these are the basically 10 that I'm expecting y'all to know and be familiar with and be able to identify and use in naming a compound. All right, well, I hope this is helpful and have a good one.